Okay, I don't want to eat up into any of Professor Mermelstein's time. I just wanted to say we're very privileged to welcome Dr. Mermelstein back to the BMT. As you know, he's the chairman of Bible, Near Eastern Studies, and Hebrew Languages at Yeshiva University, also a Class A mensch, and that is very impressive in the academy. And so it's really a great zechus for all of us, and we look forward to learning with Dr. Mermelstein over the series of the next number of weeks.
Thank you so much. All right, Rabbi Friedman, thank you so much for the invitation. Leah, thank you so much for coordinating. Hopefully everybody has the source sheet in front of you. Essentially, it's really just a duplication of the book of Ruth. We're going to be going pretty much pasuk by pasuk. As we'll see, what I want to do is present a sort of overarching analysis of the book. So it's important that you follow along, okay? I have the Hebrew alongside of the English. That will hopefully just expedite what we need to do. I'll read in Hebrew, but again, you have the English alongside it. Okay, let me introduce what I'd like to do, and then we'll get started. So Chazal, when they talk about the purpose of Megillat Ruth, I think I'm gonna try this without the microphone. It's a little bit disorienting for me. If you have any trouble hearing me, okay. If you have any trouble hearing me, please just let me know, but I'm gonna try it without the microphone. Okay, so Chazal, when they talk about the purpose of Megillat Ruth, the Midrash in Ruth Rabbah says as follows. Midrash in Ruth Rabbah says, Amar Rabbi Ze'ira said, Megillazo, this book, Ein ba lo tum'ah v'lo tahara. There's nothing about purity or impurity, lo heter v'lo isur, nothing about laws that permit, laws that forbid things. V'lama nichtava, so what exactly is the point of this book? Ela lelamedcha kama sachar tov legomlei chasadim. It's only to teach you the amount of reward that accrues to people who perform acts of loving kindness, people who perform chesed on behalf of others. Now, that's the proposition that I want to support today, namely the fact that what this book is essentially about is Hashem awarding, providing some sort of reward for people who do acts of kindness for others. Okay, so what is not going to be obvious from our analysis of the book is where exactly is Hashem's presence. As we go through the book, it seems like the only players in the book, for the most part, are Naomi, the woman who leaves with her family to go to Moab in a moment of famine and is brought back when there's once again food in Israel. Her daughter-in-law, Ruth, their relative, Boaz, and essentially those are the three primary human actors in the book. For the most part, Hashem is entirely absent. And so what I want to try to show is that, in fact, the book's account of these events is taking place on two planes. There is the plane of Hashem's actions, and then that is paralleled by a plane of human action. And that the point of the book is the way in which these two planes of action are in truth interacting. Okay. One word about my methodology and the way in which we're going to read the book. So for the most part, what is especially striking about Tanakh in general, the stories in Tanakh, biblical narrative, is that they are extremely sparing in details. What do I mean by that? For the most part, when we read Tanakh, we're not told very much. Instead, we're shown very much. So what do I mean by that? If you read through Tanakh, let's take, for example, the story of Akedat Yitzchak, the sacrifice of Yitzchak. We're told very little about how to evaluate the events. How exactly should we evaluate Abraham and Yitzchak? Which of them are acting appropriately and inappropriately? What are they feeling as the story goes on? We never actually have a window into the emotions of any of the characters of Abraham and Yitzchak, and therefore it's what makes reading that story especially difficult. How do you know how to evaluate the actions that are taking place if the text isn't actually giving us a window into the inner life of the characters? It's not just that we're missing a window into the inner life of the characters. It's also that Tanakh very rarely, the narrator rarely rises to the surface to tell us how to evaluate the events. There's very little editorializing that takes place in Tanakh. Both of those factors, the fact that we're really rarely given a window into the inner life of the characters, and the fact that for the most part, the narrator in Tanakh rarely surfaces to editorialize, to tell us how to evaluate the events. It's what makes Tanakh very difficult to read. And so what we need to do, if we want to now kind of compensate for that, what we need to do is we need to pay attention to the language that Tanakh uses to describe the events. The reason that I say we have to pay close attention to the language that the narrative uses is because, as we'll see, the way in which Tanakh compensates for the fact that there's very little access to inner life and that there's very little editorializing is very deliberate and careful use of language. And that deliberate, careful use of language, we'll see, will point us in the direction of understanding both how the characters are evaluating the events and how the narrator of the story wants us to evaluate the events. So we're going to be paying very careful attention to the language that's used. Okay, let's get started. So we're not going to go pasuk by pasuk, but we are going to be jumping around a little bit. For the most part, we are going to see most of the text. Okay, the text starts in pasuk aleph, bimei shvot hashoftim. So this is the time period during which the shoftim are the rulers in Israel. Vayelech ish mi Beit Lechem Yehuda, a man who we're going to find out is named Elimelech, left the city of Beit Lechem in Israel and Shevet Yehuda. He, his wife, and their two children. We discover in the next pasuk that Elimelech's wife was named Naomi, and their children, their two sons, were named Machlon and Kilyon. Pasuk Gimel, Elimelech dies, leaving his wife and their two sons. Pasuk Daled, we're told that the two sons marry women from Moab. The first woman's name is Orpah. The second woman's name is Ruth, and they stay there for another 10 years. Machlon and Kilyon themselves die at some point, presumably at the end of 10 years. Look at the formulation in Pasuk Hey. Elimelech, the husband has died, their two children have died. Pasuk Hey, Vatishaer ha'isha, mishnei yiladeha umei isha. The woman remains, not Vatishaer Naomi. So we were introduced to her back in Pasuk Bet, B'Shem Ishto Naomi, Pasuk Gimel, Vayamat Elimelech Ish Naomi. But now that her whole family has died, we're not told Vatishaer Naomi, Naomi remains behind, but rather we're told the woman remains behind. Now, why is that? What we're going to see as a recurring theme throughout the book is that the text is very deliberate in how it names characters. When does it provide personal names? When does it conceal personal names? Even when it tells us a personal name, when does it attach certain adjectives to those names? Namely, when do we discover that someone is a daughter-in-law, is a mother-in-law, is a husband, is a wife? Names play a critical role, and so it's not a coincidence, I think, that in this case, we're not told Vatishaer Naomi. Now, why are we told simply that the woman remains behind? Because the idea is that in the absence of her entire family, she has really lost her identity. Right? This has now left her completely lonely, completely alone in this foreign lands. And the way in which the text communicates her loneliness is not by telling us she's lonely, is not by having her express that. Rather, it's simply through the use of language telling us the woman remained rather than Naomi remained. We actually, even without observing it in the earlier psukim, there's already another instance in which we're supposed to be attentive to the use of names in the book. And that is in the names for the two children of Naomi and Elimelech. The two children in Pasuk Bet are named Machlon and Kilyon. And Chazal already observed, why is it that their names are Machlon and Kilyon? It's not a coincidence. Machlon is supposed to resonate with the word machala, sickness, and Kilyon is supposed to evoke this imagery of kliyah, or of destruction, namely that their names somehow anticipate their ultimate end. And so in the same way that already we see in the case of Machlon and Kilyon that their names are meaningful, so too I'm suggesting in the case of Pasuk Hey, it's meaningful that Naomi's name is completely omitted. Okay, Pasuk Vav, Naomi, and again, we're still not told her name. We're going to actually hear her name mentioned again in Pasuk Chet. So she and her two daughters-in-law get up to leave Sidei Moab. Now, why do they get up to leave Moab? Ki fakad Hashem et amo latet lahem lachem. They get up to leave because she had heard, Naomi had heard, that Hashem had taken note of his people and given them food. Yeah. She didn't lose her. Her name is Naomi, right? But what the text is trying to do is it's still her name, but it's giving us a window into how she feels. Meaning she feels like she's alone. Okay, so Chazal, so that's a good point. Chazal actually identify these two, Machlon and Kilion. They say that their names are actually not Machlon and Kilion. They say their names actually correspond to two children that are named in Divrei Hayamim. The two children who are named in Divrei Hayamim, I'm going to forget exactly what their names are. One is Saraf, burnt, and the other is something like Yeush. I don't remember if it's not, they're not the King Yehoash, but it might be Yoash. And what Chazal say about those names is, first of all, Machlon and Kilion weren't their real names. Their real names were those other two names. And even those other two names, Saraf and Yoash, Chazal say, it's not a coincidence that those are their given names, because Yoash, like Yeush, a total hopelessness, and Saraf, because again, their fate was to be burnt. But in any case, what Chazal are picking up on is actually their names are not Machlon and Kilion. And what the text is trying to do in attaching those names to them is to signal something about their ultimate fate. Okay, now, Pasuk Vav, Ki fakad Hashem et amo latet lahem lachem. The question is, from whose perspective are we told that they heard that Hashem had come and provided bread once again for his people? There are two possibilities. One possibility is that Naomi hears that Hashem has once again brought food back to the people. But the alternative is that this is simply presenting things from the perspective of the narrator. Meaning, I think that we as the reader are supposed to be a little bit uncertain about what exactly Naomi's perception is. We know that Hashem has once again intervened. We know that the narrator knows that Hashem has intervened. But what does Naomi know? Ki shama ki fakad Hashem et amo. Does she hear simply that the people once again have bread, or does she hear that actually Hashem has intervened? This is going to be an important question, namely Pasuk Vav, Ki shama Hashem, ki fakad Hashem et amo latet lahem lachem. From whose perspective? That's important because what we're supposed to already be thinking, and this is going to be important as we go on, what we're already supposed to be thinking is, what exactly is Naomi's perception of God's role in all of this? She's suffered tremendously. What I was suggesting based on Pasuk Hey is that she feels like her identity has been effaced. But to what extent does she attribute all of this to Hashem? And we're supposed to leave that question open-ended because Pasuk Vav is somewhat ambiguous, right? From whose perspective has Hashem intervened? Okay, we're gonna table that question. It's a question that remains unresolved, and that I think we're supposed to sort of hold in abeyance as we continue through the text. They go back to Eretz Yehuda. Pasuk Chet, Naomi says to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back to your ancestral home." Ya'as Pasuk Chet, Ya'as Hashem imachem chesed ka'asher asitem im hametim v'imadi. May Hashem deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. That's going to be an important pasuk because the idea is that there is this notion of midah keneged midah. Hashem intervenes and performs acts of chesed on behalf of those who perform chesed for others. Now, Naomi here is saying that Hashem will intervene to help you if you perform chesed, which you've already done. And she goes on and says, Yitain Hashem lachem umitzena menucha. Hashem will give you, each of you will find security in the house of a future husband. She kisses them. They refuse to leave. Naomi then says in Pasuk Yud Aleph, I have nothing more to give you. I'm not having more children. Please go back. Yeah. Right. I guess the idea is that they didn't abandon their mother, right? And they could simply have said, okay, our husbands are dead, our father-in-law is dead, poor Mrs. Naomi, we're going to leave her to her fate. But instead, what they did was they refused to abandon their mother-in-law, even though they were no longer, they were no longer married into the family, essentially. So their staying with Naomi was the act of chesed, even after the death of their husbands. Okay. Now, at the same time that Naomi says, I think that Hashem will reward you, look at what she says at the end of Pasuk Yud Gimel. I have nothing more to give you. Ki marli ma'od mikem, ki yatsa bi yad Hashem. My lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of Hashem has struck out against me. So Naomi senses that there's a chance that Hashem is present. She doesn't deny the possibility that Hashem is there, but she denies that Hashem is present in her own life, right? What I said before about that ambiguity in Pasuk Vav, to what extent does Naomi perceive that Hashem is there on behalf of the nation? That's an open question, and I think we're supposed to leave it as open. We're not supposed to know really what does Naomi think about Hashem's relationship with the nation as a whole. She certainly thinks that Hashem is not there for her. At the same time that she recognizes that Hashem might be there for others. At that point, Orpah leaves, Pasuk Yadalit, Verut Dav Kaba. Root continues to cling to her. That Dav Kaba, that verb, will become important as we go on. Naomi insists that she return El Amav El Eloha, return to your nation, return to your God, and Ruth refuses. And she says in a very memorable formulation, in Yud Zayin, Ba'asher Tamuti Amut Visham Ekaver. Sorry, I'm in the end of Tet Zayin, Amech Ami Ve'Elohayich Elohai. From this day forward, your people are my people, your God is my God. Ba'asher tamuti amut v'sham ekaver. Wherever you die, I will die. Wherever you are buried, I will be buried. Ko ya'aseh Hashem li v'cho yosif ki hamavet yafrid beini uveneich. So that ko ya'aseh Hashem li v'cho yosif, which is literally translated here as thus and more may the Lord do to me. That's simply language that is used. That's familiar language that's used throughout Tanakh for taking an oath. But against the background of what we already saw Naomi say, we shouldn't overlook the fact that here it's Ruth, the Moaviyah, the outsider, who is invoking Hashem's name. Hashem is present, and how do I know that Hashem is present? I am taking an oath in his name. We then have a contrast between the way that Ruth, the outsider, the Moaviyah, perceives Hashem's presence, and the way that Naomi perceives Hashem's presence. Finally, Naomi sees that she's not going to be able to get rid of Ruth, and so they go back to Beit Lechem together. Pasuk Yatet. Yeah. Just try a little bit lighter if you can. That's okay. And then you said that Hashem is right. Correct. Okay. Okay. Okay, good. So the question was, if in fact what I've suggested until now is that Hashem is going to intervene and perform acts of chesed on behalf of those who perform acts of chesed with each other, why exactly should Naomi perceive Hashem's hand in these events? After all, she hasn't done any act of chesed. So you're right. I think what we're supposed to understand at this point is Hashem doesn't always only act in response. It's not like Hashem remains in the background until he's forced to be activated and mobilized into action. That what we're going to see is that Hashem does manifest himself in response to chesed, but Hashem also is lurking in the background even before acts of chesed have been done. Okay, so now the two of them come back to Beit Lechem in Pasuk Yatet. Beginning of Pasuk Yatet, Vatelachna Shtehem Ad Boana Beit Lachem. Both of them are coming together. I'll take a question in 1 second. Both of them are coming back together, but look at what the people in Beit Lechem say when they actually see Naomi and Ruth. They say, Vatomarna Hazot Naomi. Is this Naomi? Notice what they're overlooking. They don't say, is this Naomi and her companion, or is this Naomi and who is this other person? They're completely overlooking the fact that there's a second person present. And look at the way that Naomi responds to this. Naomi says, after this 2-word question that they pose to her, Azot Naomi, Naomi says, Alti krena li Naomi, don't call me Naomi, krena li Mara, ki hemar shadai li ma'od. Call me Mara because Hashem has embittered me greatly. Ani maleah halachti, v'rekam hashivani Hashem. I went full when I left to go to Moab, v'rekam hashivani Hashem. But now Hashem has returned me empty-handed. Lama tikrena li Naomi, v'Hashem anavi, v'shadai heirali. Don't call me Naomi because of the way in which Hashem has oppressed me. Now, notice what Naomi is saying. V'rekam hashivani Hashem, just as the people, her townspeople, overlook the fact that she's come back with a companion, Naomi also overlooks the fact that she's come back with a companion. From Naomi's perspective, Ruth's presence is not due to divine intervention. Ruth's presence is simply because Ruth was excessively stubborn. But Naomi still feels herself abandoned, still feels herself completely lonely. Yeah. Say that again? Right, correct. Right, she accuses God of having abandoned her. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Is that what? Okay, so the question was when Naomi speaks to Ruth, she says, go back to your land and go back to your gods. I don't think that that's a recognition on Naomi's part that that other gods are legitimate. She just recognizes that these women serve another god. And so she's saying, why would you come along with me? You have this ancestral God that you worship. Why are you following me? Now, I think, yeah.
That's her essence, is that she made me stay with there. And that so persistent. I don't think so happy that we're coming this far. It's like nobody has her down.
Okay, so the question was, isn't it a chesed on the part of Naomi that she's not insisting that Ruth and Orpah come with her? Isn't that actually an act of kindness? So let's continue, because I think what we're going to see is that Naomi is very dismissive of Ruth. And I think what we would expect of somebody who feels like they want to perform an act of chesed in that way, if Ruth insists, as she does, that she has to come along, you would still expect Naomi at that point to somehow respond positively, that there would then be some sort of positive, loving relationship, which I think we're going to see in Parakat is not the type of relationship that they're going to have. Yeah. To a certain extent, I mean, what you have in Pasuk Yud Chet is Naomi sort of gives up. It's Vatechta ledaber eleh. She just stops speaking to her because she realizes this is just a lost cause. Or right. So Vatechta ledaber eleh doesn't. The sense is not that she approves of it. The sense is that she feels like she can't resist anymore. Again, I think that a reading of Naomi as in these ways, which suggests that she's positively inclined toward Ruth, we'll have to go on in Parak because I think we're going to see that it's more complicated than that. Yeah, is a burden. But she doesn't say that. Yeah, it could be. It could be that. Okay, I think it's possible to read Naomi as feeling burdened by Ruth, and perhaps that was why she was so insistent that Ruth not come back. But I don't think it's a coincidence that she completely overlooks Ruth. Meaning, I think we do have to consider the possibility that when she says "V'rikam Hashivani Hashem," she's not simply saying, "Oh, this burden." I think she's not even. She views Ruth not just as a burden, but as somebody who is, sort of a hanger-on, somebody who is. So we're going to come back to. I'm going to come back to that pasuk in a second. Okay, so Ruth says, Naomi says, "V'rikam Heshivani Hashem." Right? Hashem has returned me empty-handed. Heshivani, the root of the word Heshivani is shuv. Look at the verbs that are used in the very next pasuk in pasuk Chafbet. Vatashov Naomi. Naomi returned. V'Rut haMoaviyah chalata ima. Ruth, the woman from Moab, her daughter-in-law with her, Hashava miste Moab. The word shuv appears twice in the very next pasuk. Now, why does it appear twice in the very next pasuk? It actually is not only appearing twice in this pasuk. We go back. We're not going to take the time to actually look back at the previous pasukim. That word actually occurs about 10 or 11 times earlier in the parak. Meaning, one of the important keywords throughout parak Aleph is this word shuv, because the premise has been all along, Naomi is coming back, Ruth is going to come back, perhaps Orpah is going to come back, and yet she feels like she has come back empty-handed. Why is it that word is repeated twice in the very next pasuk? Because what the text wants us to realize, it wants to set up this counter voice to Naomi and to say, Naomi feels like she has been returned empty-handed, and she uses the word shuv in order to convey that point. But in fact, if we're sensitive to what's actually happened here, in fact, she and Ruth have already returned. There has been an act of shiva, there has been a shuv action, and the way in which the text conveys that is by using that same verb that she used, not once, but twice in the very next pasuk. Now, why is it that Ruth is referred to here as Moaviyah Kalata, not simply Vatashov Naomi Verut? What I said before is it's important that we pay attention to how the characters are named and identified throughout the book. She's not just Ruth, she's also Moaviyah Kalata. Now, why is that? So the suggestion here was that shows us that is a sort of a window into Naomi's perspective, right? Is that sort of the suggestion, that Naomi regards her as this outsider? What I would suggest actually is that if in fact what the text is trying to do in recycling this verb shuv is to say Naomi is wrong. When she says V'rikam Heshivani Hashem, Hashem has returned me empty-handed, she's overlooking the fact that there was this act of shuv. That act of shuv involved both her and Ruth. What she should realize is just how remarkable it is that Ruth has come back with her. Why is it remarkable, counterintuitive that Ruth has come back with her? Because Ruth is the consummate outsider. Ruth is a Moaviyah, doesn't belong to the nation, and Ruth is Kalata. She's a daughter-in-law. She's not a blood relative. Naomi should have appreciated how remarkable it is that Ruth came back with her, and therefore should have understood that it's not true that V'rikam Heshivani Hashem. The only way of making sense of how Ruth, the consummate outsider, has actually come with her is to recognize that not V'rikam Heshivani Hashem, right? That Malay Heshivani Hashem, right? Hashem or Malaya Heshivani Hashem. Hashem has returned me full. Hashem has returned me complete. So rather than this presenting things from the perspective of Naomi, what I'm suggesting is it's actually presenting it from the perspective of the narrator, who wants us to see this gap between the way that Naomi regards things and the way that we're supposed to regard things. You had a follow-up? Yeah. Okay, so that's true, but I think if you're right about that, the Hema Baal Beit Lechem points to the fact that they're coming back together. That should force us to go back to what the people asked and the way that Naomi responded, right? And to say, how did they overlook her presence? How did she say Berei Kama Shivan Hashem? They've actually come back together. Okay, Beit Lechem. Where did we see the word lechem used before earlier in this parak? Right, Pasuk Vav, they heard Ki fakad Hashem et amo latet lahem lachem. They heard that Hashem had remembered and had brought his nation bread once again. It's not a coincidence that this is the place to which they're going back. They're going back to Beit Lechem. Again, what we're supposed to perceive, we the reader, we have access to things that maybe the characters themselves don't have access to. We're supposed to see it's not a coincidence. Hashem returned to his people by bringing them lechem. Hashem has now returned to Naomi and therefore is bringing her back to Beit Lechem, right? The lechem being the critical piece of it. And of course, what's going to happen throughout the remainder of Parak Bet is precisely this question of how are they going to get bread? They're going to get bread because Hashem really is lurking in the background. We're beginning to appreciate that all of this is happening by virtue of divine intervention. Naomi doesn't yet appreciate that. Okay, Parak Bet. Now we find out at the beginning of Parak Bet that Naomi has this relative from her husband's side named named Boaz. Pasuk Bet, Ruth HaMoabiyah says to Naomi, I'm going to go el chana hasadeh va'alakta v'shibolim achar asher emzachein beinav. Going to get up, I'm going to the field, I'm going to glean ears of grain behind someone who may show me kindness. Achar asher emzachein beinav. After someone who will show me kindness, vatomer la lechi viti. Now, notice the change in speech. At the end of Parak Aleph, Naomi responded to a 2-word question, Hazot Naomi, with about a 30-word answer. Within the context of Tanakh, that's remarkable. We have to pay attention, very sparing amount of detail, we have to pay attention to these sorts of differences in dialogue, contrastive dialogue. When one speaker speaks very briefly and another speaker responds at great length, that tells us something. So let me give you another example where you see this idea of contrastive dialogue being important. When Yosef and Eshet Potiphar corners Yosef, and Eshet Potiphar says Shichva, 2 words. And Yosef goes on for 2 psukim. And if you look at the language that Yosef uses, he's really beginning to ramble. And what we're supposed to understand in contrasting the 2-word question, assertive, she knows what she wants, she's very forthright, with the way that Yosef responds, Yosef is rambling. He's so caught off guard, he can't respond in a very straightforward, assertive way. In part, that might show us that he's uncertain about how to respond. In part, it might show us just how taken off guard he was. But in any case, we're supposed to perceive something about the dynamics of this interaction by the difference in the amount of dialogue that's given. The same thing is happening here. What we're supposed to see by the fact that Naomi gave a very long answer in the previous paragraph. All that they asked was, Hazot Naomi. What was the answer to Hazot Naomi? Yeah, I'm Naomi. But she doesn't, because that immediately sets her off, because she's already so sensitive to the fact that God has abandoned her, that as soon as they say her name, she says, no, I'm not Naomi, I'm Mara, right? So it shows us just how kind of on edge she is. And at this point, the 2-word answer that she provides to Ruth gives us a different window into what she's thinking, namely just how despondent, just how withdrawn she is. It's not simply that she only uses 2 words. She actually didn't take initiative at all. They come back to Beit Lechem. Are they going to starve? What exactly is the plan? Naomi isn't putting any sort of a plan in place. It's Ruth who has to suggest what the plan of action will be. And again, when we think about how are characters referred to in the context of Sefer Ruth, look at Pasuk Bet. Vatomer Ruth HaMoaviyah El Naomi. Not Vatomer Ruth el Naomi, Vatomer Ruth HaMoaviyah, because again, what the text is doing is accenting her status as an outsider. It's remarkable that it takes the outsider to basically kind of assume responsibility for their situation, to take the initiative. Naomi, who's the insider, come back to her ancestral city, is completely withdrawn. Yeah. Okay, so she says "Lechi biti," good. So there is a certain term of endearment there. And I'm not sure exactly how much to read into that. Meaning, I'm not sure whether when she says "Lechi biti," she regards her, whether that's a statement of emotion or not. My instinct is that it's not, for reasons that we'll get to later, when the way in which they're referred to shifts, where she's no longer referred to as just Hamoaviyah, where she begins to be referred to, where the narrator begins to refer to her in terms of her family relationships. That's why I'm not sure how much to read into that one reference, but you're right for drawing attention to it. Okay, she goes to the field. Pasuk Gimel, Vatelech vatavo vatalakei basadeh acharei hakotzrim, vayiker mikreha. So the English translation here, Vayiker mikreha, as luck would have it. Now, we already, on the basis of Parak Aleph, should realize that what's happening here on the human plane is actually just a reflection of what's happening above on the divine plane. That Hashem actually is very much present. That was the conclusion that I suggested on the basis of the end of Parak Aleph, so that when we come to Parak Bet and we discover Vayiker mikreha, it happened to be. What field does she happen to end up in? In the field of Boaz, who we already were told is this relative of Naomi and of Elimelech. Ruth at this point can't possibly know that Hashem is the one who's orchestrating all this. She doesn't even know who Boaz is. She certainly doesn't know that Hashem is kind of orchestrating this from the background. But we, the reader, should realize that Hashem is now making himself very much present. And Vayikar Mikreha, it's not a coincidence that that's the language that's used. It just so happened that that's where she ends up, precisely because Hashem, we know, is already very much entering into the picture. And in case we miss that fact, in case we miss the fact that Hashem is present, look at how the characters speak to each other in the very next pasuk. V'hine Boaz bami beit lechem, vayomer lakotzrim Hashem imachem, vayomru lo yivarechecha Hashem. Now, when the characters speak to each other that way, when Boaz says to when he says to his workers, Hashem imachem, Hashem is with you, and they say back to him, Hashem should bless you, that's just typical forms of greeting. We have forms of greeting like that elsewhere in Tanakh. But again, if we're thinking already, we should be thinking, oh, Hashem is here, so that when we hear that language that's being used by them, we hear it in a way that they didn't necessarily intend. They just intended it as, hello, how are you? We hear, though, oh, Hashem is very much present in this field. The reason that the text begins to make that point somewhat explicit is because this is going to be characteristic of the way in which narrative in Tanakh unfolds. It's very subtle. The narrator rarely rises to the surface. We're rarely told how to think about the events. But in order to ensure that we don't completely miss the point, even if we're kind of being brought along slowly and subtly, the text finally will make sure that we get what's happening. And what I'm suggesting is that's sort of what's happening in Pasuk Daled. Okay, Boaz says to his worker, Lemi hana'ara hazot. To whom does this woman, this na'ara, Ruth, belong? Now, notice the contrast between the way that Boaz here speaks and the way that the townspeople in Beit Lechem spoke. In the previous parak, what we saw when Naomi and Ruth come back, what the townspeople said was, Hazot Naomi. Again, not taking regard for the second person who is present. But when Boaz looks out at Ruth, he doesn't overlook Ruth, and he uses the language of Lemi hana'ara hazot. That hazot, I think we're supposed to hear echoes of what the townspeople said previously, and we're beginning to see Boaz as responding to Ruth very differently from any of the characters before. He does notice Ruth. I'll take questions in 1 second. He does notice her. The answer that he receives in Pasuk Vav is, she's an Ara Moabiyah who came back with Naomi. And then in Pasuk Chet, Boaz speaks to her. Vayomer Boaz el Ruth. Now, Vayomer Boaz a Ruth. Boaz doesn't know who this person is. He wasn't told what her name is. His workers don't know what her name is. They don't say, this is a Nara HaMoaviyah, whose name is Ruth. She came back with Naomi. She's just an anonymous Moabite woman. Why is it then that the text in Pasuk Chet says, Vayomer Boaz el Ruth? Just notice what the text doesn't say. Vayomer Boaz el Ruth HaMoaviyah. She's not Ruth HaMoaviyah. She's simply Ruth because now Boaz is treating her not like an outsider. Boaz is treating her like a person in the way that she hasn't been treated yet by anyone. Not by the townspeople, not by Naomi after they came back. Boaz is finally the first one who really recognizes Ruth. And he says to her, don't go to any other field. End of Pasuk Chet, L'cho titbakin im na'arotai. I want you to stay attached to my young people who are present. Tidbakin is the same verb that we saw earlier in Pasuk Aleph, Verut Dav Kaba. Even after Orpah left, even after Naomi tried to rid herself of Ruth and Orpah, Ruth continued to cling to her, and the same verb is used here. Why is the same verb used here? Again, to show this, what we're beginning to appreciate about the dynamics of these events, namely that Hashem is making himself present, and he's making himself present in response to chesed that people perform for one another. That was what Naomi herself said to Ruth. What Naomi herself said to Ruth back in the first parak was, Ya'as Hashem imachem chesed ka'asher asitem im hametim imadi. Hashem should perform chesed for the chesed that you've already shown. And we're beginning to see the same language being used to describe the chesed that Ruth performed for her, the Ruth Dav Kaba, is now the verb that is used for describing how Boaz is treating Ruth, v'cho titbakin, because Ruth is finally being rewarded for the chesed that she showed to Naomi. Yeah. What's that? Calling her. Yeah, back in Pasuk, where are you? Yeah, Halo Shamat BT. Okay, good. Yeah, okay, so he has some sort of, he has some sort of statement of affection or something like that. Okay, let's continue. He says, don't go anywhere. Pasuk Yud, Ruth finally speaks in response, and she says, Madua matzati chen be'enecha lahakireni va'anochi nochriya. Why have you decided to show me this act of kindness, considering that I am a foreigner? There are a couple of things that are noteworthy about that pasuk. First of all, what we hear, we haven't heard Ruth's desperation. This is the first time that we actually are given a window into how Ruth feels throughout all of this. We've been told, again, we read between the lines, we were able to determine somewhat how Naomi regards these events, but never Ruth. All that Ruth did at the beginning of Parak Bet was to sort of project confidence. She says, I'm going to go to the field and I'll follow Asher, I will follow Achar Asher Emzachein Beinav. I'll follow whoever decides to show me kindness. What we hear from what Ruth says in Pasuk Yud is she's actually surprised that anyone chose to show her kindness. Ruth was apprehensive, but when she spoke to Naomi at the beginning of Parak Bet, and said, I'm going to go, someone will show kindness toward me, she was projecting confidence because she recognized what Naomi needed, even while Ruth herself was extremely apprehensive. So when she finally experiences this act of kindness, she's taken aback. Why are you showing me this act of kindness, considering that I'm an outsider? I'm an outsider because that's how everyone until now has treated her. The townspeople, Naomi, until now, no one in the field has given her the time of day. Why is it that you, Boaz, are paying attention to me? And the play on words shouldn't be overlooked. Lahakireni and nochriya, the root of the word lahakireni is nun kaf resh. Nochriya, why were you lahan kireni, considering that I am a nochriya? There's a certain dissonance between those facts that's captured by the play on words. The dissonance is, if I'm an outsider, why are you actually showing me this act of kindness? And Boaz responds to her, it's because I heard about the chesed that you performed on behalf of your family. Pasuk Yud Bet, Yishalem Hashem Pa'olech. Hashem should reward your deeds. Utihi maskortech shlema. You should have full recompense from Hashem. Asher bat lachasot tachat knafav, under whose wings you have sought refuge. That language is going to be important, as we'll see later. And Ruth continues and says, I'm so appreciative of what you have done for me, ki nichamtani, because you have consoled me, because you have comforted me. She needed that nechama. Again, gives us a window into how she's thinking that we didn't really have beforehand. Okay. She returns successfully from the field, and she goes back to Naomi. Pasuk Yotet. Now, Naomi sees that she's coming back with a basket full of wheat, and Naomi says to her as follows, Vatomer la chamota, efo likat hayom ve'ana asit. It's not Vatomer la Naomi, or Vatomer Naomi l'Ruth HaMoabiyah. It's Naomi, her mother-in-law, speaking to her. This is the first term of affection, the first familial relationship that we're hearing about in terms of how they're connected since they came back from Beit Lechem. Why is it that all of a sudden we're not told that Naomi says this, or we're not seeing Ruth referred to as Ruth HaMoabiyah? Because now that Naomi sees how successful Ruth was, she naturally feels an affection. She naturally feels a greater affinity for Ruth because she sees that Ruth is really taking care of her. And she says, Yehi makirech Baruch. And Ruth responds and says, I went to the field of this person named Boaz. Naomi responds as follows, Pasuk Chaf. Vatomer Naomi lechalata. Again, a relation of affinity, not Vatomer Naomi el Ruth or Vatomer Naomi el Ruth HaMoabiyah, but Vatomer Naomi lechalata, because now she's treating Ruth, now she regards her as family, because she feels cared for. And she says to him, Baruch hu Lashem asher lo azav chasto et hachayim ve'et hametim. Now, the question is, when she says, blessed be he of Hashem who has not failed in his kindness to the living or to the dead. So if you look in the English translation here, blessed be he of the Lord, comma, who has not failed in his kindness to the living or to the dead. So blessed be he of the Lord, comma, means that Naomi here is blessing who? Is blessing Hashem. What if you didn't have that comma? What if you simply translated this phrase as, blessed be he of the Lord who has not failed in his kindness? Who then would she be talking about? Boaz. So there's an ambiguity in what she says. When she says, Baruch hu Lashem asher lo azav chasto, blessed be he to Hashem who hasn't abandoned his kindness, it's not clear whether she's referring to Boaz as the person who should be blessed, who hasn't abandoned them, or whether she's referring to Hashem. And I think that this is a case of deliberate ambiguity. It's not a coincidence that both of those possibilities are plausible. I think that what we're supposed to see, we the reader, are supposed to realize that both of them are true simultaneously. That Boaz, in providing lechem for Naomi and Ruth, is really just an agent of Hashem, who brought the people bread, who acted on behalf of the nation, according to Perek Aleph. And by Boaz now providing bread for Naomi and Ruth, Boaz is really acting as an agent on behalf of Hashem toward these two individuals. And that's the significance of this deliberate ambiguity. Namely, we're supposed to see both Boaz and Hashem acting here in concert, right? That there is this intersection. Okay, Vatomer la Naomi karov lanu ha'ish miko aleinu. Now just notice, Naomi speaks twice in that pasuk. Vatomer Naomi, Baruch hu Lashem asher lo azav chasto et hachayim ve'et hametim. Vatomer la Naomi karov lanu ha'ish miko aleinu. Why does she speak twice? So she speaks twice. This is a common feature of something we find in Tanakh, namely when you have two speech acts consecutively without any sort of interruption, often it's because the dialogue partners, there was supposed to be a dialogue taking place. So in this case, the interlocutor, namely Ruth, was supposed to respond to what Naomi said, but Naomi makes this very odd declarative statement, Baruch Hu Lashem, and Ruth looks at her quizzically. And so therefore, Naomi continues and says, Karov lanu ha'ish. If you just imagine what this interaction looks like, Naomi is overjoyed and Ruth is extremely confused. When she speaks again, when Ruth speaks again in Pasuk Chaf Aleph, Vatomer Ruth HaMoaviyah, she hasn't been referred to as the Moaviyah since early in the book. Why is she now Ruth HaMoaviyah again? So if we go back to the previous words, Karov lanu ha'ish migo aleinu hu, he is one of our relatives. He is among those who is supposed to redeem us. Naomi is now speaking in the collective. He is one of our relatives. He is one of our goalim. And what Ruth, the sense is, Ruth feels somewhat uncomfortable. Ruth is taken off guard a little bit by Naomi referring to them in the collective, because until now, all that she's experienced from Naomi is distance, alienation. And so finally, when Naomi includes her in this, she feels vulnerable and feels a little bit uncomfortable. So Vatomer Ruth HaMoaviyah shows us not how Naomi regards her at this point, but how Ruth feels at this point in the text. Okay, Naomi then instructs her to go back to the field and not to go anywhere else. Parakim. Vatomer la Naomi chamota, biti halo avakeshlach manoach asher yitabach. I'm going to read a few psukim here. V'ata halo Boaz modatanu asher hayitad na'arutav hinehu zareh goren hase obrim halayla. Right, so he's in Pasuk Aleph. I'm going to seek a home for you. Go back to the field. V'rachat v'asacht v'samsin lotayach alayach v'yarat hagoren. Go back to the pressing floor. Don't let anybody know that you're there. V'hi v'shachvo v'yadadat hamakom asher yishkav sham uvat v'gilit margalotav v'shachaft uhu yagid lach et asher ta'asim. 4 psukim worth of dialogue. And what is it that Ruth says in response? Kol asher tomri elai eseh. Pasuk 4 words. So if we go back to the earlier point that I made about contrastive dialogue, we're supposed to pay attention to how long each of the characters speaks for. Just notice the total transformation. At the beginning of Parak Bet, when the 2 characters spoke, all that Naomi had to say was L'chi biti, just those 2 words. At the beginning of Parak Gimel, now the tide has turned completely, so that now it's Naomi who is proactive. She's the one who instructs Ruth, and Ruth is finally being cared for, and she's able to express the fact that she's being cared for by speaking very briefly. All that she's doing is following instructions. It's as if Naomi now is beginning to appreciate that something more is happening here than meets the eye. Pasuk Aleph is interesting. Halo avakeshlach manoach asher yitabach. The word manoach also came up previously. When Naomi was speaking to Ruth and to Orpah back in Parak Aleph, what Naomi said to them was, Yitain Hashem lachem umitzena minucha. Hashem should provide for you, and you should find minucha, isha beit isha, in a new husband's home. What Naomi there was saying was, Hashem will provide you for that minucha. So that when Naomi here says, I will provide minucha for you, halo avakesh lach manoach, it's not just Boaz who acts as God's agent in the story. Now we're discovering it's also Naomi who acts as God's agent. All 3 characters at different points represent Hashem's will. Ruth represented Hashem's will by accompanying Naomi back. Boaz represented Hashem's will by being the provider. And now we see, now that sort of the dynamics between them have shifted, now it's Naomi. Earlier, what she said was Hashem will provide for you, and now she is essentially the vehicle for Hashem. Now she's going to be the one to provide. Okay, Ruth goes back, goes to the field, and speaks to Boaz. In Pasuk Tet, she says, finds him basically sleeping. She introduces herself as Ruth. Pasuk Tet, ufarastach anafecha alamatcha ki goel ata. Spread your wings over me, over amatcha, over your maidservant, because you are a goel. Again, same language that we saw used earlier. When Boaz was praising Ruth for the chesed that she showed to Naomi, the language there was, The language that Boaz used to describe what she had done in Parak Bet, Pasuk Yud Bet, was your schar from Hashem should be complete, asher bat lachasot tachat knafav, because you've come to rest under his wings. So that when Ruth now says, spread your wings over me, what she's essentially saying is, again, we hear this, maybe this is not the way that Ruth intends it, but if we compare the language, Boaz now, once again, is going to be the divine agent acting toward Ruth. Earlier, he was the divine agent acting toward both Naomi and Ruth in providing lechem for them. Now, it is going to be Boaz acting as the divine agent by marrying Ruth. Again, that language being important. Okay, he instructs her, she says, I will do anything that you want. Go back to Naomi, but before you go back to her, Pasuk Yud Zayin, so we're skipping most of the way toward the end of the parak. Before you go back to her, al tavoi rekam el chamotech. Don't go back empty-handed. Of course, where have we seen that word rekam before? That was a critical pasuk at the end of parak Aleph. When Naomi was speaking to the townspeople, she said, "V'rekam hashivani Hashem." So what is Boaz now saying to Ruth? Go back so that you should not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Again, this language recalls that earlier language, and Boaz, we're now understanding, actually represents Hashem, whereas earlier Naomi said, Hashem has sent me back empty-handed. The fact that now Ruth is never coming back to her empty-handed is a way in which we, the reader, come to appreciate that, in fact, Hashem has been with them all along. She never went back empty-handed. She perceived that, but in fact, Hashem has been there all along and continues to be there working through the different protagonists in the story. Okay, beginning of Parak Daled, almost done. Beginning of Parak Daled, Boaz is now going to perform the action that Ruth has requested on his behalf. And he says, Vayomer surash vapo ploni almoni vayasar vayeshe. He calls over this other person, this other Goel, whose name here is Ploni Almoni. Now, Ploni Almoni is not a name, right? Ploni Almoni is correctly translated here as, come over here, so-and-so. Presumably, Boaz refers to him by his actual name. Why is it that the text conceals his name and simply refers to him as so-and-so? So if we go on and look at how he and Boaz discuss what's supposed to happen next, look at what he refuses to do. He refuses to marry Ruth. In marrying Ruth, what he should have done, according to Pasuk Hey, the reason to marry Ruth was lahakim shem hamet al nachalato, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate. By refusing to perpetuate the name of her dead husband, Ploni Almoni acted inappropriately, and the way in which the text communicates that is by depriving him of a name. Instead of perpetuating the name of others as he should have done, what the text does for eternity is to wipe out his name and instead simply refer to him as Ploni Almoni. They get married, and Ruth is hailed by the townspeople toward as we continue through Parak Daled. Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayomru kol ha'am asher basha'ar v'hazkenim edim. So all the people at the city gate are witness to this marriage. Yitain Hashem et ha'isha haba'a el beitacha kerachel uchleah asher banu shtehem et beit Yisrael va'asechayel be'efrata u'krashem b'beit lachem. Yitain Hashem. So just keep track of that. Pasuk Yud Bet, they continue speaking. V'hi beitcha kebeit Peretz asher yalda Tamar lihuda min hazera asher yitain Hashem lecha min hana'ara azot. A second time in the course of these two psukim that Hashem is referred to as the actor. Pasuk Yud Gimel, they stop speaking in Pasuk Yud Bet. Pasuk Yud Gimel, Vayikach Boaz et Ruth batihilo liisha vayavo eleha. They have relations. Vayitain Hashem la herayon bate levein. This is really the first time since the very first parak that the narrator confirms divine action. The first time that we heard about divine action was Kifakar Hashem et Amo latet lahem lachem, provides bread for them. This is the second time in the whole book, all the way at the end, that we hear about from the narrator's perspective that Hashem has acted. And just notice, it's the third time in the span of 3 psukim in which Hashem is described as the actor in a way that we haven't seen virtually since the first parak. And what I said before is that we're expected to read closely because biblical narrative is very subtle. But if we get to the end of the story and still haven't kind of appreciated the overarching point, which in this book is that Hashem is lurking in the background, orchestrating the events on behalf of people who perform acts of chesed for each other. If we miss that point, we don't leave the book failing to appreciate that. And the way in which the text makes sure that we really grasp that point is by making it clear, Psukim Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, and Yud Gimel, Hashem is the one who's acting, particularly in Pasuk Yud Gimel, where the narrator himself is speaking. So Hashem is the one who gives them children. Now, the title of my talk was, Is Ruth the main character in her own book? We're going to read the final psukim in a moment. We're going to read the next 2 psukim and then we're going to finish. Ruth was not present at the beginning of the book. Naomi was present at the beginning of the book. And we've seen Ruth for the last time already before this marriage took place. The stage basically concludes with one person present, or with 2 people present. You have Naomi and you have her companions. But Naomi is the one who is present at the beginning of the story, and she's the one who is present at the end of the story. Essentially, what I would suggest is that Naomi really is the main character in the book. And why is that? So let's take a look at what the people say to her, what the women say to Naomi after a child is born to Boaz and Ruth. Pasuk Yudalid. Vatomer Hanashim el Naomi, Baruch Hashem asher lo hishbit lach goel hayom v'yikarei shemo b'Yisrael. Lo hishbit lach goel hayom. Who's the goel who's being referred to in Pasuk Yud Aleph? So it's the child. V'yikarei shemo b'Yisrael is referring to the goel. So we're now actually hearing about a second goel who functioned to redeem Naomi. The first goel, of course, was Boaz. But Hashem, who orchestrated that union to begin with, Hashem was the one who brought the first goel. We're just told also brought the second goel, also was a partner to this conception and to this pregnancy. That's what the previous pasuk told us. And so Hashem's actions here have not only been on behalf of Ruth, but really have been on behalf of Naomi in order to ensure that she did have a goel, v'yikarei shemo b'Yisrael. V'hayalach l'meishiv nefesh. L'meishiv nefesh, again, that's the same verb that we saw at the beginning of the book. When she says, V'rekam heshivani Hashem, Hashem has returned me empty-handed. What do we find at the end of the book? Hashem did not return her empty-handed at all. This child is a meishiv nefesh. This is going to restore her spirit. This child essentially represents something that we should have appreciated from the very beginning of the book, which is that Hashem has been lurking in the background, kind of playing puppeteer this whole time, and this child really is just the climax of that. Ki chalatech asher ahivatech yiladatu asher hi tovalach mishiva banim. Your daughter-in-law is better for you than 7 sons. What is it that Naomi said to Ruth and to Orpah? I have nothing more to give you. I have no more children to bear for you. And what do the women say? Ruth is actually better than 7 sons that you could have had. Again, there's a total transformation in what Naomi expected would happen. Naomi expected that God had abandoned her. V'rekam heshivani Hashem. Naomi expected that she would never have more children, but what we discover is because Hashem was present this whole time, she actually does. There is a Shiva, and there is another child. And notice the name that is given to this child in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Yulad Bein LaNaomi. This child is named for Naomi, right? That a child has been born to Naomi. Why do I say that this book really is about Naomi rather than Ruth? Because to the extent that the book really is about history operating on 2 planes, the divine plane and the human plane, where they intersect. Hashem intervenes in human action through the agency of individual people. That was the lesson that Naomi failed to appreciate at the end of the book. As the book went on, Naomi seems to have begun to appreciate it, and the text clarifies that that's what's been happening all along to Naomi, only at the end. So it's really, the book really is about Naomi, her destiny, and kind of the slow acknowledgement on her part about the relationship between Hashem and people, the intersection between these two planes. Thank you.
But now we're actually pushing in a way, right?
I know I'm a couple of minutes late, so I'm going to just stop. Everybody should feel free to leave if they need to, and I'm happy to stay around for questions in 30 seconds.
She sort of pushed Hashem saying earlier on, right? And here. So it was not, she was looking for it. She had just difficulty finding it, and finally turns around and of course it ends up with Hashem.
Right. I mean, she was hoping. It's not that she doesn't claim that. What's that?
She was not abandoned.
Correct. Right. Meaning she continued to believe in Hashem. She just believed that Hashem had abandoned her, failing to realize that actually Hashem has been there the whole time. Yeah, exactly. Correct. I think we're gonna pause here. I'm happy to stay around for questions if anybody wants, but I think we'll just pause here. Right, and meeting for all. Yeah.